It's the last hour of trade on Wall Street, and this is how the markets are looking. The Dow was down very sharply at the beginning, but reversal of trend, now up more than 0.5%. One of the big stocks on the move, Apple, up 2.5%, along with other tech stocks. We will explain why, because the markets are moving, and these are the drivers of the day. Russia and China vow to join forces and even drop the dollar. FANG stocks rebound on the eve of Apple's big announcement. Apple's pulling up all the others. And the governor stays on. Mark Carney extends his term at the Bank of England. Live from the world's financial capital, New York City. It's Tuesday. It's September the 11th. I'm Richard Quest. I mean business. Tonight, Beijing and Moscow are cozying up to each other, trying to fend off Donald Trump's attacks on their economies. In the shadow of the largest war game since the end of the Cold War, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin kicked off the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. President Xi says the world has increasingly unstable factors, and it's now up to China and Russia to keep things together.
Amid rapidly evolving global situations with increasing unstable and uncertain factors, the joint efforts by China and Russia to maintain international justice and fairness, as well as world peace and stability, are all the more important.
Matthew Chance is in Moscow. This is quite extraordinary in many ways. The Russians and the Chinese, are they ganging up on the Americans?
Well, I think to a certain extent they are. It was extraordinary listening to that soundbite from Xi Jinping and worrying if we're depending on the Chinese and the Russians to ensure security and world peace. But what is being developed here is essentially an anti-Western, anti-US axis, with one end being occupied by the Chinese and the other end being occupied by the Russians. And from a Russian point of view, that all got, into full swing back in 2014, after they annexed Crimea, after the relationship with the West started to really sour, after sanctions were imposed on Russia by the European Union and by the United States and by others. They decided to pivot east and look for other partners. And they embraced China. It previously had been a potential adversary for Russia. They've embraced China. They've done hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade deals with Beijing. And this is yet another sign that that relationship, in the face of US pressure, is getting ever stronger. And it's transformed the geopolitics of that region, the geopolitics of the world. These powers who were previously, as I say, adversaries, are now very much an alliance. OK, they're an alliance, and we're seeing the commercial aspects of that. Alibaba announcing that it's going to open up in Russia. Alibaba shares were up over 1.5%, having been down on the loss of Jack Ma. So the tentacles of this promise to be ever greater. Yes, and that Alibaba deal is a great example of the kind of deals that are being done, because, of course, the Russians could have quite easily have done a deal, you'd have thought, with a Silicon Valley e-commerce platform, but it didn't. It did it with this Chinese rival to Amazon, and they won't give exact figures on how much it's all worth, but it's several $billion. 52% of the new joint venture is going to be run by Russian entities, including Mail.ru, which has something in the region of 97 million users on its Facebook clone site, VKontakte, and the rest of it mainly owned by Megaphone, which is a mobile service provider which has something like 80 million users in Russia. And so a really big market that this e-commerce platform, this new platform, is going to be tapping into. Matthew Chance joining us from Moscow with the broader picture now. With the strokes of his pen in Washington, Donald Trump has made life increasingly difficult for these two countries. For instance, of course, there's the trade war with China, which promises to get even worse, and exports are slowing, and Donald Trump is threatening even more tariffs on the way. Hundreds of billions of dollars
if he goes through. The yuan's under pressure, the currency's in trouble, and the People's Bank of China is willing to let it fall for now. Donald Trump is complaining of manipulation, by the way. It doesn't seem to be the case. The market seems to be moving it at the moment. And Russia's and Western sanctions. Vladimir Putin needs new economic allies, as while oil prices and the pressure of OPEC and wants oil lower prices from Donald Trump. But that, of course, would hurt Russia. This is fascinating for Fareed Zakaria joining me. It's fascinating because these two countries are not naturally allies.
They are not naturally allies, but the central issue on which they are allied is the out-of-control power and role of the United States, and particularly the role of the dollar. Let's remember, the United States is the world's superpower now on two dimensions, military and the role of the dollar. The dollar has become the global currency. The reason when the United States pulled out of the Iran deal, it cratered the Iranian economy, is they can't do business with Total, they can't do business with the South Koreans, because everything gets priced in dollars. That has to go through New York. It has to clear the Fed window. What Russia and China are saying is, we want a new system. We don't want the dollar to be the supreme. And here's the most dangerous part about it. Because of the way Donald Trump has unilaterally and arbitrarily used the power of the dollar, the Germans, the French are sympathetic to this view. The German foreign minister said, we need a European alternative to the SWIFT payment system, which is essentially, again, the dollar-based system.
The dollar, I think you would agree, though, remains the world's major and dominant reserve currency, as long as there is a single monetary policy, the Fed.
Well, here's the paradox. Every other area of the world, we are seeing multipolarity. That is,
right.
More and more countries are growing. They're becoming more important. Percentage of global GDP. China has gone from 1% to 15%. The one area where, even though America's weight in the world economy has actually decreased over the last decade, the dollar has increased in power. The dollar has increased in power because you need a common currency.
But you need a common currency with an element of stability and virtually total integrity.
Precisely.
And, you've got, okay, so the euro has it starting to get that through the ECB, right. But it's still a fragmentation of the various members of the eurozone. Nobody would suggest the ruble or the yuan has the level of integrity from an independent central bank.
So you're pointing out all the reasons why the dollar has become dominant. But it is also causing a great deal of unease. Give you an example. When BNP Paribas gets fined by a local regulator in New York, $8 billion, I think it was, they had to pay because you can't operate in global markets if you run afoul of the dollar. But people view this as arbitrary, capricious, and Trump's pulling out of the Iran deal had a much bigger effect than people realize. The Germans are now talking about an alternative to the dollar. The Chinese and the Russians are. It's an uphill battle. I agree with you, Richard, but you shouldn't abuse your power in a way that invites people to start looking for alternatives. This is one of the foundations of American superpower.
All right, so my enemy's enemy is my friend, we could arguably say, with Russia and China. But do the two eventually come to blows or at least fall out? And if they do, what would it be over?
I tend to think not, and I'll tell you why. They're no longer equal in any sense. China is vastly the most superior power. The Russians realize that.
They accept that?
I think they do. I think that they won't say that. They're a proud country. But if you look at the nature of the deals, it's absolutely, look, China is now the largest economy in the world. The Russian economy is, I think, roughly the size of the Netherlands economy. This is a question of big brother eating smaller brother.
Great to have you. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
Thank you. And